Here's everything that comes in the box for the rear bumper assembly with the tire carrier. And for the tire carrier, we have our spindle, our bushings, the swing arm assembly. We have our offset adjustment for the actual tire mount. We have our tailgate assembly bracket with our turnbuckle, our extension for our camera in the back, our inner fender liner that we have to adjust for. We've got our end tanks here with the corner weldment. We have our center section. Of course, this is all our stamped steel parts. The other weldment for the mount side, and as these will be seen later, these tanks aren't actually tanks in this mount, but here's everything that we have out of the box and what we're going to start putting together. Now, just before we get into the installation, I did want to mention one more option that is going on this particular carrier, and that is going to be the fuel caddy. This gives us a little over 10 gallons of extra fuel without taking up any extra space. Our first step is removing the rear bumper, and it does have some electrical, so we're going to have to locate this harness. It's up here on the left-hand corner of the bumper driver's side. We're going to disconnect that and just leave that hang, and we're going to use this later. Moving into the inner fender well, we have to remove this lower panel. There are 3 bolts here we have to take out, and once we get those bolts out, this panel will fall out of the way, exposing the 4 bolts that we have to get out of the bumper and mounting assembly on each side of the vehicle. Now, with those 4 bolts exposed, we can get the 2 that are in the inside of the frame out first, and then we're going to move to the outside edge here, and we'll get those 2 removed, and this should cause the L bracket that connects the outer edge of the bumper to the frame to fall out of the way. Now we have to remove the factory tow hook, which requires us to remove 2 bolts from the bottom and 2 bolts from the side of the frame. We're going to retain all of that hardware as we're going to use that later, but we are going to dispose of that hook. We've got a couple more screws here on the bottom of the bumper that mount to some brackets, and that'll make the bumper loose, but we're going to have to put a pry bar between the bumper and the frame rail, and we'll have to do this on each side, and you'll apply a little bit of pressure and you'll feel it pop loose from that frame rail. Again, we'll do it to the other side, and that'll free up the bumper, and we'll have to set this assembly aside to extract some of the electronics. We've got our sensors, our license plate light, and main harness, so we'll have to get all of that out later. Now, these next steps regarding the tailgate are for those that are installing the bumper with tire carrier. If you're not doing the tire carrier, you can omit all the steps involving the tailgate here and move right on to the installation. For those that are doing the tire carrier, we need to expose some wiring here, and as you can see, I just firmly pulled and removed that panel. You can use a panel popper or whatever you feel is necessary. The wires we're paying attention to here are going to be the center wire, which is for our third brake light, and the top wire, which is going to be for the camera. We're going to take those, just put those behind the panel, move to the other side where we're going to free up the grommet and pull those wires through, making sure that the connectors don't get caught up on the lip and get damaged in the process. Next, we have to remove the camera housing, and we'll use the Jeep tool to move it to the unlock position and simply slide that over the top. With that removed, we can go on to removing the entire carrier assembly. And what you're going to see me do here is only loosen one of the 2 bolts on the top and all the ones across the bottom. And that's simply so that I can grab and hold onto that assembly as I remove that last bolt to make sure it doesn't swing down and damage any paint in the process of removal. Now we have a few of these torque spit screws we have to remove to expose the wire harness for the center high mount stoplight. Now we can separate the 2 halves and it'll expose the harness area. We're going to have to pull it through this little pinch channel on the outside and then disconnect it from where it's connected to the camera harness. Before we can actually pull the camera harness, we do need to unplug the light and just pull this through. It's taped in place. We'll have to get that through the top piece here, and then we're going to have to flip over to the top side to remove the panel that holds the rear view camera as well as the lug nuts for mounting the rear tire. Once that assembly is pulled out, be careful not to damage the lens on the camera. This will fall to the bottom, and as you can see here, we're going to have to do some more work and pull through a couple more of the mounting screws that hold the camera in place. And then once we've got that, we have to disconnect the harness. Again, be careful here, making sure you don't damage the wire. Pull it through, and you'll see that the camera itself just pops into place. There's a couple of little tab areas that you'll have to push through and then pull the camera assembly out. Now I'm going to go on to fitting the corner tubes, and as you can see, I have removed the tanks. Those will need some modification, but we'll save that for a later step. The driver's side is going to be loosely hung here. I'm going to move on to the passenger side. And something to note is that the frame itself has some welding, and there is some variation from manufacturer on side to side. And you will see getting these aligned just right so that you can slip them over the frame tube might take a little bit of work, but they do fit up once you get them. Unfortunately, I didn't roll my camera on the driver's side hardware installation. The driver's side works just like the passenger side, except for the fact you're going to be reusing the factory left side tow hook and the hardware that it came with. On the right side here, AEV supplies you with all new hardware since there was no tow hook on the side. Basically, we've got the 2 bolts that come in through the bottom plus the 2 that come into the side, and then we have a U-bolt that goes around the frame and connects the front section of the tube to the side of the frame. And don't forget, we have these L-bracket bolts that are in the frame that we have to get snugged up. There's the driver's side one as well as the passenger side one before we move on. Now the next section here is going to be one I am speeding up, but it's going to be a lot of repetition. You're going to see here, in order to make sure that the bumper is aligned correctly, I'm taking several measurements to see if the distance changes. We want that top area to be completely flat, so AEV has provided shims in the event that your measurements show that the top is either pinched in or pushed out. Here, the top on mine was pinched in, so I'm inserting one of the shims. I'm going to have to tighten that up and then basically go through the process of remeasuring to see if the shim is adequate. This is a process that you're going to see me go through a couple of times here, and that means literally taking everything you've done, undoing it, and putting a shim in, and retightening things back up and remeasuring. So this step is one that's a little bit tedious, but you might also be lucky, and your frame on your Jeep may be a little bit more square. But the great part is AEV has provided you all the tools you need to make sure that you can get yours just perfect. As this is a load-bearing device, we want to make sure that from both the impact and crash safety stuff, from dropping this off on a shelf to carrying the spare tire carrier, that everything is at the proper torque spec. So make sure that you refer to the manual on the proper torque settings and use your torque wrench. The final step will be to lock in the positions that we've just spent all of this time adjusting and finally torquing in. As you can see here on the top of this particular side, this is the passenger side, there's this hole. We're going to go ahead and use that hole as a guide to drill through the frame and put a bolt through. The bolt is supplied by AEV, and this is simply going to lock in all of the work that we've done and supported by the factory bolts on either the left and right side and through the bottom of the frame. This next step is required for those that are reinstalling the rear bumper sensors, and we're going to have to make some modification to the side tanks here. And as you can see, I'm just going to go ahead and prep some tools. We're going to need something to drive the hole saw through the pre-marked hole, which you can find right here in the middle. And you're just going to take your time here and make sure you keep it nice and perpendicular and lightly cut into this and use consistent speed. For this type of measure, I do like to use a little bit slower speed device. This happens to be my air drill, and this does a perfect job at cutting out just enough material and making sure that you don't poke through. And we'll have to repeat this process for the other side. And remember the 2 things here: controlled movement perpendicular to the flat of the actual area we're cutting, and again, light force to make sure that we don't cut through. Switching to the front side, we do have a dimple that is pre-marked by AEV here. I am using a step bit and the same drill to work my way through. As you can see, I'm only applying light force to make sure that we only get up to the 3/4 inch step. The beautiful part about this is that it leaves a really nice clean surface, so there's very little deburring you have to do, and once you do get to your final hole size, you're going to make sure that's nice and even. And we're going to repeat this process for the other side as well. Now we have one more cut we have to make, and this is simply opening up the 2-inch hole that we've drilled. We have to do a little bit extra clearancing in the corner here, which is going to square off the circle, and that's just to make sure that the sensor can be installed correctly. After you've done some deburring and getting rid of some excess material, this is what our modified hole should look like for the driver's side. Now we're ready to go into the rear bumper and extract all of those sensors. And this process is going to mean that you're going to have to tear apart that bumper completely. We're talking about removing just about every screw in it in order to extract each of the 4 sensors and, of course, the main wire harness, which you're going to reuse in the AEV bumper. Starting with the middle 2, these are the easiest to get to. These are the ones you're seeing right now. The other ones will require that you disassemble the outer section until it looks just about like this. And when you finally get to the point where you're ready to extract the sensors, they do come out fairly easily. Installation is just as easy as long as you've made the hole size correct. We'll push those through. We'll put the retaining clip that AEV provides on the back. We've got a bolt that goes in here, and basically that bolt is already on a little like nutsert, and we'll tighten those down. Again, the specifications are provided for you in the instruction sheet. Once those are in, we're going to repeat this for the other side, and then we'll move on to the center section of the bumper where we'll put the same brackets on those same sensors. Here you can see what it looks like. It's a pretty straightforward process. We've basically got a bolt coming through one side and we have the nut on the other side. And as you can see, the notches on the side of the sensor retainers will dictate where they go. Here it doesn't matter. You can have them both facing in, both facing out. It doesn't have a bearing on the functionality of the sensor. Now we're going to work on the AEV tire carrier bracket, and we've already installed the plastic block here with those 3/8 bolts. And we're going to put those in the middle setting and then kind of arrange the bracket where it's going to be to see where the interference places are on the back of the factory tailgate vent. Here, once we've marked those, we're going to go ahead and just clearance that. You can take the vent out if you want to, but I found that a set of flush cuts is more than sufficient for clipping the edge and then cutting that material flat. It's definitely not hard material, so getting through the process of removing enough of it with the set of either side cutters or in this case the flush cuts was more than sufficient. Here's another angle to take a look at how it was modified and what the finished product should look like. Now we're ready to reinstall the AEV tailgate bracket. We just want to make sure that we're reusing the factory hardware and those nylon bushings so we're not damaging the paint. We'll get these started by hand and then we'll cinch them up. The big thing here is just to make sure everything stays aligned as we go through and get all the bolts into their final position. Once we're done with that, we're going to move on to our next step where we're going to put the Zerk fitting in the spindle housing. Once we get that started by hand, we're going to go ahead and put a wrench on that until we get it into the proper orientation. Now we can go ahead and complete the installation of the spindle mount using the supplied hardware that AEV has in the kit. Once that is set up, we do have to put the bronze bushings in and make sure that we put them in the order as listed in the manual and do not use any type of tool that would force them in that could damage or deform its overall shape. Before we can put the carrier on, we do have to remove the passenger taillight. There is a plastic panel on the inside here we're going to remove. Then there's a bolt that is the only bolt that holds the taillight in. Here I'm just going to use one of my power tools to pull that bolt out. And once that bolt is removed, this gives us access to the outer assembly. And all we have to do is pull that outer assembly straight off the vehicle. And there's going to be one plug that houses all of the wires for the assembly. This is one of those quick releases, so pull that red pin out as a safety retainer and then pull the plug and then set the light aside so it doesn't get damaged. This is our first test fit, and what we need to do here is get everything correctly stacked for the spindle. So we're going to put the bronze bushing on top, and when we insert the carrier, we want to be careful not to cause any undue force to deform any of the bronze components. Once that spindle has been assembled from the top, we'll reach down below and put the bronze bushing and then the last washer on the bottom and install the bolt. Here's an idea of what everything looks like when you get everything installed and ready to do a final fitment. Now that we're happy with that position, we're going to lock everything in, grab our torque wrench, torque it up to spec, and we're going to remove the carrier. With the carrier out, we can go ahead and install the tanks, and that's our next step coming up. Now we can put the tank back in place. We're going to use the hardware we took off and slide that over the spindle. If you don't happen to be putting on the tire carrier, you can put the cap on here as we're not going to need access to that area. There should be two caps in the packaging, which is for the right side and the left side. And of course, if you're not using the carrier, you don't need it. Here we have a couple of hex bolts that'll go into the side of the tank, and we'll have one coming in from the bottom. This will complete the tank install. We need to repeat this for both sides. Now we can grab our center section and install that between both end tanks. This should just slip into place if we've done all our measuring correctly. Once that's in place, we've got a couple of bolts. We'll put in the two on the passenger side, and then we have the one on the driver's side. Once all of that is installed, we can go ahead and move on to the foot step pad. They've provided us with all new clips. We'll insert those on the bottom and align them to the holes on the top of this center section. Now we're ready to conduct the final installation of the tire carrier, and here we're going to insert the spindle into the spindle housing, take care with the bronze bushings and washers. We're going to make sure these are adequately lubricated before we place it into the spindle housing, and then once we get everything pressed into place, we have, of course, our little bushing that goes on the bottom, as well as the steel retention disc, and once we get that bolt in there, we're ready to move on to the next step. Here we're going to put the wheel mount onto the tire carrier, and that's the square end in, and you want to make sure that you have the right lug nut orientation as shown here. And then we're going to feed our cable through, which is going to go through the top hole on the back of the square, through the center, and then there's two exit points, one that's all the way out the front for the camera, and the second one that's down through the middle. Here, once those wires are run, we're going to want to push this grommet in so that it looks like this when we're all finished. Now we're going to prep the cam we removed from the stock assembly, and if you do have a vehicle like mine that has the front trail cam, the rear camera is smaller and will require that you use this adhesive-backed rubber shim. The other camera does not require this as it's a little larger housing, so this step is optional based upon the equipment that your vehicle has on it. And then we have this O-ring that's going to slide into the groove, and once that is completely assembled, we can take this unit and place it in the new clamshell that's going to hold the rear view camera on the back of the AEV carrier. So as you can see, we're installing it. It goes in on an angle that's kind of facing down towards the ground, and it only fits one way, so make sure that you have that correct. We're going to line up the pins and then go ahead and put the two sides of the clamshell together. Once we have this assembly done, we're ready to go over to the spare tire carrier and look at how this inserts into the full assembly. Now we're going to go ahead and plug in the camera with the extension cable that's been provided. This will plug right into the back of the camera the same way the stock one does. It does have to align to a tab. It only goes on one way. Once that's plugged in, we want to push that into the end of the carrier. This should be a firm press in, but we also want to make sure we're not pinching any wires. So when we are sliding this in, it does only go one way. We want to make sure that the third brake light harness is still hanging below in the proper position. Now we've got the turnbuckle set to that 6.5 to 7 inch area that we're requested to do so in the manual. I'm going to go ahead and put the inside bolt through, and then once I get an idea of how the turnbuckle sets inside of that, I'm going to put the bolt in on the outside and look at what it's going to take to put washers in a fashion that keeps that turnbuckle nice and level. Here I can kind of adjust it with my finger, and I'm taking whatever number of washers I can get to get that nice and level look, and then I'm going to put the rest of the spacers down below. So here I've got my stack that looks like it's the appropriate height. I'm going to go ahead and slide that in above the turnbuckle, put the bolt through, and then take the little bit larger stack and place that in the bottom and slide that through. Again, this just makes it easier to do with one person. Otherwise, you'll be dropping washers left and right. So we'll get this kind of loosely set, and then what we're going to have to do is open and close the door to determine where we need to seat this inside of that plastic bushing that's against the inside. So I want to get this all just snugged up, get my wires run through the appropriate place, and get that pushed inside the door. So once we got everything adjusted on the door and we're confident everything's lined up with that bushing, we have this cap to put on. But if we're going to be doing the fuel caddy, we do have to look at how that's going to fit, and that's going to require us to remove some of that wiring as well. We're going to have to take the turnbuckle loose again to get all the sizing and fitment correct. And as you can see here, I'm doing a little bit of pre-fitting to kind of see how everything works together. And it's definitely something that I would say would be easier with a second set of hands. You can manage yourself, as you'll see what I go through here. We've got to get all those wires that we pushed through the original mount plate through the fuel caddy and then onto the carrier itself. So once we have that through, and you'll see the wires dangling behind, we've got that square receiver and the caddy all lined up. We'll basically be able to start working from the back forward. First thing we're going to have to do here is make sure that the wire isn't pinched anywhere, and we have a plate that we have to put on. They do supply all the hardware for this, and this plate is the primary support that holds the fuel caddy to the carrier. So these bolts go through, and then we have the main bolt, which we're going to apply some anti-seize to and have this safety washer. We're going to want to thread this all the way into the front carrier assembly. However, we're not going to make the final adjustment on this until we actually have the tire back spacing figured out. And in my case here, I found that 3/4 of an inch from the flat surface was about accurate. And then once that's ready, we have to put the retaining bolt through the top, and this is going to prevent this assembly from collapsing backwards. And basically I found if you use a magnetic type device here to put the bolt in the hole, you can go down that whole distance and get that nice and snug. With that snugged, we do have to put the other retainer in, and that's simply this clamp that goes around the bottom and a single bolt. Now that we've got the depth correct, we can pull back those safety tabs on that bolt, and you can either use pliers like I have here, or you can use a hammer with a screwdriver to flatten it across the surface of the bolt head. Again, this is just to make sure vibration doesn't cause this bolt to back out and cause any rattling on the rear tire carrier with the mounted wheel and tire. Lastly, we got to clean up our wiring here. A zip tie through the appropriate hole will allow us to get this tucked back into where it needs to be. With the turnbuckle back in place, we can do the final wiring here and get the harness tucked away where it needs to be, and of course pushing the end leads back into the tailgate so we can get those wired up to the factory harness. You're going to want to make sure you get a nice firm seal on this and that there's no issue with the rubber fitting, otherwise we're going to have leakage problems there. On the inside of the tailgate, we're going to use these extensions that were provided by AEV to plug into the factory harness. This should be straight plug and play. You can't mistake one for the other. The camera harness as well as the third brake light are both unique plugs, so that should go together quite easily. Once that's set, we have to put the panels back in, and Jeep has made this really easy. These are all quick release and quick push in type connectors. So get the part back on the back of the tailgate, knock it around, make sure all those green connectors are still there, and then pop in the beauty cover that goes over the center section here. And that'll wrap up the last of what we do inside this tailgate. The last portion that we have to do for the tailgate is reinstalling the third brake light. We are reusing the factory one here. Unfortunately, my video was corrupt, so I don't have that, just the still shot. But as you can see, we're basically bolting the factory light with a couple of little tabs that were trimmed into the new AEV assembly, and this will push on over the camera assembly right down the middle of the carrier. Now back to the bumper, we are going to reuse the factory license plate light, and that just unbolts from the factory bumper. There's 2 bolts behind here and that factory harness that'll plug right in. Now, you don't have to put the flare extension on that you see here, but I feel it's just one of those beautiful finishing touches that AEV puts on their product to really feel factory integrated. This also, however, does have an effect on those vehicles running a 37-inch tire with 2.5 inches of lift, where on the up travel, you will get some contact with the factory splash or inner fender, and this eliminates that with the upper portion of the flare extension, as you're going to cut out and remove some of the material that might come in contact with the larger and taller tire. First thing we have to do is mark off the metal portion that we have to remove, and this is specified inside of the instruction book, and it will tell you that you have to trim both layers of the metal here. It is double thick, so we do have to go about 3/4 of an inch back and about 1.5 inches up. And once we put our cut line down, we want to protect the area around there, whether that's going to be the shocks or the painted areas. If we're going to use a cutoff wheel, we're going to get a lot of sparks, so we want to make sure that we're not causing any damage while trying to complete the cut. So here, you're going to see I'm going to remove that material. And again, this is a double thick area of material, so make sure you cut through both segments. And then once you get that cut off, we're going to spend a little time deburring that, and then we're going to try to do a test fit to see if we've removed enough material. So here I'm going to take that fender extension, kind of push it up against that inner fender. We're going to have to modify that next, but it does look like I can get it into position without touching the metal, and that's really all I'm checking for right now. Now I'm confident that I don't have to do any more cutting. I can remove the spat, put up something to protect the area around from some overspray, and put in some rust prohibitive paint. And really all we're doing here is just making sure that we don't get any unwanted oxidation on any of the metal surfaces. And then while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and start to address the fitment for how we're going to modify the factory inner fender. Referring back to the instruction guide, it does give you a shaded area, but I like doing my own fitment here just to make sure that I don't cut any more than I have to. And really with the thickness of this extension, you can cut a little bit less material, so I'm running anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch less material than specified in the instructions, and it doesn't seem to affect the overall fitment. And at the end of the day, in this case, I would like to do less is more. If I accidentally cut too much here, it can leave a hole and it can create some undesirable effects, whether it's splashing around more of the mud on the inner fender well to leaving a spot where it might flap in the wind. So here I've cut a little bit less. I'm going to clean up the area just a little bit, and that'll complete our validation fit. And I can take the extension over to the bench, and using the predefined dimple holes, I'm going to drill the 3 holes through the front face, and then I'm going to flip it over and clean the holes out through the back of the flare to make sure that there's nothing binding when we put the bolt through. Now, the first thing we're going to want to bolt to is the tank assembly. We want to make sure that this lines up just right to the fender flare. As it is an extension, we want those visual lines to be correct. Once those are bolted in, we're going to move to the inside and get the 3rd bolt, which connects to the inside fender flare. And that finishes up our flare extension and our install with all the options that I've equipped on the rear bumper assembly with the tire carrier. This is one of those things that I will say I'm happy to see the end result, but it did take a lot of work to get there. The features on this tire carrier and rear bumper I think are second to none. You have the option of carrying a 37-inch tire like I have here with a 10.2 gallon reserve. Fuel is always going to be a thing. Big tires and Jeeps don't have the greatest size gas tanks, but this means I don't have to have external cans such as a Rotopack or a jerry can. This is nicely integrated where it's almost hard to see. On top of that, the tire swing can even hold a 40 if you're going to go big tire and keep all that weight off of our tailgate door and still have one-hand operation. Couple that to a higher angle of departure bumper that still uses the factory hitch and provides additional protection along the side corners for the tub, It really does give you, I think, the most amount of feature and a very good aesthetic as well. Super pleased with the end result. I can't wait to get the front bumper on, so stay tuned for that. And of course, if you like this content, please hit the like button. If you'd like to stay informed of the next content I'm building, make sure you hit that notifications bell, and maybe I'll see you on the trail.